Hi, everybody. My name is David Hoffman, Rabbi David Hoffman. I am the president of the Honey Foundation for Israel, and our foundation is dedicated to building and supporting inspiring leadership in Israel, leadership across the spectrum of Jewish life that are building Jewish communities. And that is actually the departure point for what I'd like to talk about over the next half an hour or so. There has been a robust interest in Jewish sources and engagement over, I would say probably the last 10 years, a renewed engagement in Jewish sources, in Jewish learning, beyond the traditional Jewish community. That is to go ahead and say people who had not gone to Jewish sources as a source of inspiration for their own lives necessarily. And so there has been this development of secular, what we might refer to as secular learning academies, secular Shavuot. So that is a departure point. The second point I would like to mention, and very importantly, this article actually incited, if you will, the class that we're going to go ahead and spend the next half an hour with. And this is a journal called Tikkun. This is the 39th volume of this. It comes out once a year in the state of Israel. And it is a collection. It is a legal journal. It is a halakha journal, and it represents, I would say, mainstream centrist Israeli Zionism. So it's the religious community, it's the Dati Leumi community, but it's a Dati Leumi community, Zionist, and rather centrist. And in this collection was an article, and I'm not necessarily going to go ahead and mention his name, or why not? Harav Yehoshua Shapira, Harav Yehuda Goldberg, and they are Rosh Yeshiva, heads of an academy, not in the West Bank, not in a small little village, but in Ramat Gan in Israel. Right, Ramat Gan, right next to Tel Aviv. So we're dealing with a community that is very much a part of the main social fabric of Israel. Has a very significant population of secular Jews. And the question that they consider is the status, the legal status of Batei Midrash, of learning academies that are secular. So the question, in some ways, at least as far as I'm concerned, I mean, it's almost offensive. That is to say, we might go ahead and celebrate. Let me speak in my own voice. I would go ahead and celebrate the learning, the return to sources of the population. There is a Daf Yomi class in Tel Aviv for people who are not religious, who understand their own identity as not dati, and yet every single day they come and study the page of Talmud that the rest of the Jewish world is studying. I would celebrate that fact, whether they emerge into religious people of any stripe. In some ways, for me, is less important, as opposed to the fact that they're engaging with Jewish sources. So these two rabbis of this yeshiva go ahead and study, and they ask the question of whether it is legally permitted for these batei midrash, according to halakha, to exist. Can you go ahead and teach secular Jews Torah if you know they come from the vantage point and a commitment of not necessarily becoming religious Jews? And I want to go ahead and quote you a sentence, and this, in fact, will be the departure point for the sources that I want to go ahead and consider. They go ahead and write, within this framework of the acrimonious culture wars that are being waged on the topics of religion and state in our days. So America is not the only place, obviously, where such culture wars exist, and the topics of religion and state are particularly pronounced in Israel. Recently, we have witnessed the phenomenon of secular yeshivot, secular learning academies, the thing that I was just talking about a second ago. And he goes on to say, they go on to say, this phenomenon flows from the claim that the Jewish library is not the exclusive property of the religious community. So he's setting this up and he's suggesting that this is a fallacious claim. The Jewish library is not the exclusive property of the religious community. He wants to go ahead and obviously question that. Moreover, the claim continues that it is the right of every Jew to understand. He's suggesting this is the erroneous claim of these secular yeshivot. Moreover, the claim continues that it is the right of every Jew to understand and explain the Torah according to his or her own understanding. The question before us, is it indeed the right of every Jew to go ahead and explain the Torah according to his, her, their own understanding? Is that not something to go ahead and celebrate? Many articles, he ends the opening paragraphs, many articles have been written regarding the question of whether it is permitted to teach Torah, halachic articles, to someone who does not believe in the divinity of the Torah, believes that the Torah comes from God. However, there is a great difference between one who is distant from the Torah, so go the authors and go ahead and say, one who is distant from the Torah and one who does not believe in it and nonetheless claims a status as a legitimate interpreter of Torah. So what they're saying in this last sentence is, it's one thing we have spoken about, and generally it's agreed about in the religious world, that one can go ahead and teach people who are distant from the Torah in the hopes that they become Ba'alei Tshuva, returnees to traditional Judaism. But what about the idea of one who does not believe in it? And I would put parentheses, one who does not believe in it, perhaps in the ways in which you believe in it. They believe in it, right? Or believe in God, but perhaps in different ways. And nonetheless, and here is the crux of what we're discussing. This is the cultural disagreement. Nonetheless claims a status as a legitimate interpreter of Torah. So my dear friends, this is the question. Who may be considered a legitimate interpreter of Torah to the process of Torah? There is no better question to go ahead and consider on Shavuot night than this question. Who may be understood as a legitimate interpreter of Torah? What are the boundaries of interpreting Torah? Is there only one voice in Torah itself, or in fact, are there many voices, many different ways, not only to interpret Torah, but to hear Torah in the first place? So this is the question that was presented before us in this very mainstream halachic journal. And I would like to go ahead and once again use that to go ahead and talk about different ways of understanding what it means to engage Torah and what might be considered a legitimate understanding of Torah itself. Okay, so the name of our study together over the next couple of minutes is Who Owns Torah? Is there only one community that owns Torah? Is there only one community that owns the right to interpret Torah? So I would like to begin with this generative moment, the founding moment of the receiving of Torah. And what I suggest to us is that embedded in this very moment is an indication of the multivocal aspects, the fact that revelation itself is not in one voice. So you see this text, V'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot. And then it goes on to say, Ve'et kol hashofar, and the voice of the shofar, ve'et hahar. And in fact, this is the Jews as they were gathered at Mount Sinai, and they hear the voices, and it's translated thunderings, sounds, voices, and that's a translation of kolot, and the lightnings, the lapidim, and the voice of the horn. Now I want to point out this word, kol. Kol is voice, the kol of the shofar, the voice of the shofar. The voice is in singular, yes, because there is one shofar. and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled. This is the formative moment at Mount Sinai. So the commentators and readers of Torah have had two classic questions. One is the verb chosen, ro'im et hakolot, to go ahead and see the thunderings. I translated it as perceived, but the Hebrew is ro'im. They saw the thunderings. They saw the voices. That is an exegetical question that we will leave for another time. What I want to go ahead and focus in on is the following. Why is kolot plural? And you see kol shofar, that is in the singular. So the Midrash Tanchuma, that is to say, was it not the idea that the voice of God that was echoing from Sinai, that seemingly had scared these people, was singular, was in one voice? Now, that's how readers of the Torah have approached this verse. And more interestingly, I want us to go ahead and see how the rabbis read this verse, because you might go ahead and say that kolot is not the singular voice of God, but kolot rather were the sense of thunder, the thunderings, the voices of lightning and thunder. Maybe it should be plural, but the rabbis don't understand it that way. The rabbis go ahead and use the plural of what they understand to be the singular voice of God to make a conceptual and, dare I say, an ideological point. We point to the Midrash Tanchuma. Now we are in the rabbinic period, the first couple of hundred years after the year zero, and listen to how the rabbis go ahead and read this. And all the people perceive the thunderings and the voices. The verse, according to the rabbis, does not say, this is their point, perceive the thunder or voice in the singular, but rather the thunderings and voices. Why was kolot in the plural? The Rabbi Yochanan explains this. Rabbi Yochanan explained this as follows. The sound went forth, the original sound from Sinai of revelation, of the revelation of the Torah, the words of the Torah went forth, and then they divided itself. They divided themselves at first into 7 sounds. So imagine a sound emerging. It divides into 7, and the 7 sounds, in fact, disperse and become the 70 languages of so that all the nations might hear. This is a fabulous and important image. This is a moment when the rabbis are imagining what the giving of the Torah look like, and not only the reception. And you have one voice, one singular voice of the Torah dividing up immediately into 7 voices echoing forth, and those voices get translated into different languages. So what I would go ahead and I want to emphasize here with these ideas is that you have the rabbis imagining that one voice, one sound is almost insufficient to go ahead and contain all the meanings of the Torah. It immediately needs to go ahead and fracture, to divide itself. And then immediately the rabbis tell us the nature of the fracture. It divides off into different languages, and different languages of the words of Torah allow Torah to be understood by a greater number of people, because not everybody understands one language. And I would also suggest to us that languages are a metaphor. It's not simply like Hebrew and English and Aramaic as languages, but rather languages are a metaphor for a translation project of different concepts and ideas. Sometimes you need to explain an idea to a person or a community in different terms than another community. You need to translate the idea not into another language, but in a different set of ideas and things that can be resonant with that community itself. And I think that the rabbis knew that. And so what happens here is, according to this midrash, an early midrash of the rabbinic period, this midrash Tanchuma, the rabbis immediately go ahead and imagine one voice dividing into lots of voices that were then translated into different languages that help more people understand. The next source is how that idea gets played out in the Babylonian Talmud. And Rabbi Yochanan, now we are in the section of the Babylonian Talmud that deals with Revelation. It's in Shabbat on page 88. And here Rabbi Yochanan also, listen to what he has to say. Every utterance, each and every utterance, kol dibor v'dibor, every single word, sheyatza mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that left God's mouth, as it were, divided into 70 languages, immediately divided itself into 70 languages. And then in the school of Rabbi Ishmael, he then goes ahead and says, I have another image for you. There's that one word dividing forth, right? The one word emerging into 70 languages. Rabbi Ishmael then goes ahead and says, imagine a hammer striking a rock. Just as a hammer cracks and smacks a rock, so too words of Torah. Just as as this hammer breaks a stone into several fragments moving apart, and I would almost say also, listen, think about the sparks that fly. So too, so you see the fragments dispersing, so too each and every single word that moves forth from the mouth of God divides into 70 languages. And once again, you have this idea of an original word breaking forth, turning into, taking a new form of different languages so that in fact, different communities can go ahead and hear in different ways. And what I'm moving us towards is this notion that as the rabbis understood the original moment of the giving of the Torah, that foundational moment, they didn't understand simply one word, one message, and it's heard by everybody in the same way. In fact, Torah is a dynamic process that gets broken off, that must get broken off into different languages because different people need to hear things and receive things in different conceptual frameworks and different words. And in fact, the original message gets played out in those very different languages. Now, we will bring this all together in a couple of minutes, but I want us to look at a very early midrash, the Midrash Mechilta. And here, rabbis once again are talking about and all the people saw the kolot, the sounds, and they suggest kolei kolot, the sounds of sounds. And you can almost imagine sort of the sound waves rippling forth, the sounds giving birth to sounds, giving birth to more sounds. You can see the ripples flowing forth from that original moment. And how many sounds were there? The meaning of these words is that each person heard the message of Torah according to, and they go ahead and use a verse from Psalms, which is unbelievable, but listen to this. They heard the message of Torah according to his, her, their strength, ability, and unique talents. And listen to how the rabbis came to this idea, because they quote the verse, Psalms 29, verse 4, Kol Adonai Bakoach. Kol Adonai Bakoach. Kol, the voice of Adonai Bekoach. And what does Bekoach mean? It could be translated as in strength, right? But the way the rabbis are translating it is that the kol, the kolot, the voice, the sounds of revelation of God are moving forth Bakoach, and they're actually absorbed and received Bakoach according to the strength, according to the powers, according to the ability of each and every person. So we have a different model here. Before we were talking about one model of words echoing forth, being translated conceptually into different languages and different ideas, the original moment of Sinai. Here, the rabbis are imagining the plurality of sound, that is to say that there was one sound, but what happened was that each individual receives Torah according to their strength, talents, the ability, and even not only simply like intellectual talents. I don't mean to go ahead and say, if you're smart, you go get this. If you're less smart, you get this. It's your own sensibilities. According to your own inner life, you receive a different measure of Torah. According to who you are, that is the way in which the kol needs to affect you. And so according to the Midrash, according to the Mechilta itself, you see that the Torah as conceived of by the rabbis is not one message. It in fact changes in its reception, and that is not only okay and acceptable, but in fact is embedded in the original vision of what Torah can be. And to make this idea very, very clear in a midrash that is just spectacular, absolutely spectacular, I want to read this with everybody. Rabbi Yossi, this will be a play on the original idea that we just learned in the Mechilta. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, when speaking about the revelation at Sinai, according to each person's, and he's playing on the same verse in the Psalms, up above, the voice of God is in each person's strength. Kol Adonai Bakoach. The voice of God, the message of God gets received according to each person's nature, strengths, according to each person's strengths, ability, unique talents, disposition. The words of Torah would speak to them. The words of Torah would speak to them. And this is amazing because Rabbi Yossi realizes what he just said is extraordinary. And so he immediately speaks to the community and says, do not be shocked. Do not be surprised by the audacious claim that I have just given us, that each individual received Torah in a different way according to their own talents, according to their own dispositional makeup. And he says, we have an analogy. We have another way of thinking about this, the very same different receptions of the same thing, because it was analogous to the man. He says, remember the man. Shehaya haman yored li Yisrael. Kol echad ve'echad hayat to'amo. He said, remember the man that fell, that fed, that sustained physically the Israelites in the desert. So too Torah that sustains the Israelites spiritually. The man fell in the desert to the Israelites, and each Israelite would go ahead, and I remember this, as a little child, and it was like the best aspect. It was one of the most fun things of studying about the Exodus from Egypt, at least for me. You would get the man, and each Israelite would taste the man according to that person's strength, ability, talents, and what they wanted. So I would imagine that if I took the man, right, that came from heaven, and if I wanted it to taste like marshmallows, or I wanted it to go ahead and taste like steak, I would have delicious steak, and I would have marshmallows, and I would have candy. This is what I thought as a child. And then, so what the rabbis are using is take that idea that each person experienced the man according to their own disposition, but according to what they needed and wanted out of it. Young people according to their needs and talents, old people according to their needs and talents. The man was experienced differently. It was given by God, and yet it was received differently by each person. It interacted with their desires and what they wanted and what they needed. And so too Torah, just as man nourished people physically, so too Torah nourishes people spiritually. And once again, these are very, very traditional midrashim. And what they're doing here is undermining the idea that there is one voice of Torah, and it is the idea, and the spiritual challenge is simply to go ahead and to submit to that one idea. Who am I to interpret it? Who am I to say anything? The sources that we have seen before us are all about indeed God, worked out in the very project of revelation itself, that people would experience, interpret Torah differently. That's why it had to fracture in so many voices and sounds, be translated in different languages. And what we've just learned here are two midrashim which go ahead and say that the same word of Torah, now they're not using the image of it fracturing into different sounds and being translated, but they're using that the same message of Torah would be tasted, would be used, would be absorbed according to the koach, according to the strengths, talents, disposition of that individual Jew. That is the beauty of Torah. And I wanted to simply go ahead and summarize here is what I am saying. No. Let me correct that. What the rabbis are saying, what the rabbis of the Midrash and what the rabbis of the Talmud are saying is that Torah, receiving Torah, learning Torah is an intimate experience, and it is not one size fits all. And in fact, Torah itself has to go ahead and translate into lots of different languages. Torah itself gets represented in lots of different tastes for every Jew. How could it be otherwise? Such an intimate endeavor, such an existential endeavor that it needs to go ahead and impact a person's life. How could it not be responsive to who the people are in very different ways? So this, I mean, even as you see at the outset, is a completely different model than the notion that one idea needs to be received, and who am I to go ahead and interpret the Torah? In fact, differently than other communities, right? Other Orthodox communities, the answer is, according to these rabbinic sources, in fact, Torah understood by God gets interpreted in radically, gets received in radically different ways. Okay, this is one model that I want to go ahead and offer us. Now I want to go ahead and offer us an even more radical model, and appropriately, I'm not going to go ahead and offer it, but it is going to be in the words of the first chief rabbi of the land of Israel, and that is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook is the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of the land of Israel. He does not make it to the state of Israel. He does not live into 1948. But I want to suggest to you that he offers an even more radical notion of what truth is, of what Torah is, than we have seen develop in those midrashim. A point of introduction, he is a rabbi in the land of Israel in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. He is trying to create a Judaism that will go ahead and speak and to realize, to explain, better said, the Zionist project, even the secular Zionist project, as a religious endeavor. And he wants religious Jews to certainly see that what non-religious Jews, very committed secular Jews who have rejected the Torah, seemingly have rejected religion, in their building of the state of Israel, in the land of Israel, in fact, they are fulfilling an aspect of Torah itself. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and see how this plays out. He is going to go ahead and riff on a statement in the Talmud at the end of the tractate of Brachot, and listen to this. We have Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Hanina, saying, Torah scholars, Talmidei Chachamim, go ahead and bring increase, marbim shalom, go ahead and bring peace, increase peace in the world. Now, he'll go ahead and raise this point, but Torah scholars, if you've walked into an academy, Torah scholars increase peace in the world? Really? there's a lot of machloket, there's a lot of disagreement. That you walk into a Beit Midrash, everybody's arguing with everybody else. Is that peace? Hold it. As it says, and then he quotes a verse in Isaiah, as it says, all your children, banayich, are students of God. The Rav Shalom, and great is the peace of your children. So he's going to go ahead and play on certain words. And he's going to go ahead and the Midrash says, read not banayich, your children, increasing peace in the world, but rather your builders. And your builders, first of all, let's leave open that the builders of the land of Israel, but the builders, Talmidei Chachamim Marbim, who are also increasing peace in the world. Rav. Okay. So listen to what he has to say. There are those who erroneously believe that world peace, shalom, will come only from a common character of opinions and qualities. There are those who believe that the process of peace is that everybody thinks alike and agrees, and everybody will go ahead and have the same ideas. So when they see scholars investigating with their wisdom and on it, right, and investigate, and because of their investigations, multiple positions and perspectives are then generated. It's fractured. Seemingly, there is disagreement. They think the intellectual investigation is actually causing disagreement and discord. The exact opposite of peace. In fact, if you actually have the framework that what peace will ultimately be is everybody who thinks alike and everybody will agree on ideas, they'll just be so clear, then it must be that those people who are investigating and coming up with different positions and different ways of thinking about the world and other issues are actually bringing less peace. But he says that is wrong. But in reality, this is not the case, because the only way true peace will come to the world is precisely through Rav, the multiplicity of peace. Rav Shalom, the multiplicity of peace. And by the way, let's play on the notion of peace and shalom and shalem, whole. Hold on for a second. The multiplicity of peace comes when all possible sides and opinions and perspectives are seen. All of these different sides and opinions and perspectives are seen. And it will become clear how each one of those opinions and perspectives has a place according to its value, its place, and its topic. They have a unique place in the world. Moreover, regarding the issues that seem extraneous or in fact even contradictory, positions that look like they are totally in opposition. They are, but hold on. When all sides of the truth are revealed, we will see that is only by gathering all of these parts, all of the parts, including those things that are contradictory and diametrically opposed. And you gather all of these details and all these divergent opinions and all the disagreements, and precisely by clarifying all of these, we will see the light of truth and righteousness. Truth, abstractly, is not everyone agreeing, but truth, shalom, is bringing together all of these seemingly disparate positions and holding them. And listen to this image. It is in this way that Torah scholars increase and expand peace in the world. The light of knowledge needs to shine from all of its sides and from all of its facets and perfilation of the greatness. And listen to this. Don't read children, read builders, because a building is built from different parts, and the truth of the world will be built from different sides, from different approaches, and from these and these, elu ve'elu, from these are the words of the living God. Rav Kook is offering us a gorgeous and important model for understanding truth, of what truth, in fact, what might be. I want to say it, and then I want to relate it to what it is that we're talking about. Truth is not everyone finally agreeing to the clear vision of God and submitting to the will of God. That is not what truth is. That is not the nature of truth or the religious project. Rather, he is entertaining a world where truth, where Torah contain within it, in fact, diametrically opposed. And so ideas, imagine a house and there are walls. Imagine a diamond and there are facets. Each one of the sides of the house or the diamond needs to be there. It is very different than the other side. It's on the other side. It's perhaps diametrically opposed. But the point being here is that the whole of truth, the whole of Torah, is not two-dimensional. It does not have one voice. It needs to have multiple sides that, in fact, some of these sides actually disagree and look like and may, in fact, contradict with one another. But in the fullness, in all of its contradictions, the house actually sustains and is able to go ahead and stand. You need all of these parts. So what I would go ahead and suggest, what Rav Kook is suggesting to us, is that what looks like that the Chilonim, the secular, they're builders. They are totally different than the world of the builders in the yeshivot, seemingly. But in fact, perhaps both are needed. In fact, both are needed to build the fullness of the house of truth, because without it, with only the Torah, echoing from a singular Beit Midrash in Bnei Brak or Yerushalayim, you would have one wall. And what you need is a house. And for that, you need multiple walls that, in fact, bring into the fullness of people's voices, of people's ideas, even when they're contradictory, even when they are very, very different. A single wall does not represent the fullness of the Jewish people. And so this idea offers a very contradictory idea to this notion, which is that truth, Torah, echoes forth in the designated Batei Midrash of the Dati Leumi community, as if to say there's only one voice coming out of the religious community. And of course, we know that that is not the case. That is just singularly wrong. There are many voices. There are many ways to go ahead and experience Torah. And in fact, according to Rav Kook, all of those voices are not only acceptable, but are needed to build the fullness of Torah. And to return to the Midrashim that we saw up above, is that according to the rabbis, revelation itself, that means God's plan is that Torah, that one voice, needs to go ahead and be broken up into different voices in different languages for different communities to go ahead and receive and use and speak about. One way of speaking about Torah does not represent the fullness of the Torah. So to bring this all together, how fortunate are we to live in a world where the voice of God, just like that original moment of revelation, is actually echoing forth and splitting into one voice, into another voice, into another voice, and moving forward from that original moment of Sinai. It was not the case 10, 15, 20 years that our communities, all of these communities that were returning, there is a LGBT Beit Midrash in Chicago that is studying Talmud. That is fabulous. That Beit Midrash will go ahead and echo voices of learning in Talmud in ways in which that other Batei Midrash will not be able to. The voice of God will be projected in ways in which it needs to be, it was intended to be, and it continually needs to fracture so that more people can hear it, more people can own it, more people can then reverberate it outwards. And that's the majesty of receiving Torah, and that's the majesty of the Torah itself. Kolot, plural, kolot. It wasn't kol, it was kolot. And perhaps that's the deepest message. Now we just have to hear the voice of the Torah and echo it out for others. So thank you very much for spending some time with me. Again, David Hoffman of the Honey Foundation for Israel. And may Israel know peaceful days ahead. Chag Sameach.